It's been a long time since 2 gigabytes of RAM has been recommended for a gaming PC. For the past few years, 8 gigabytes has been the standard, while 4 gigabytes was considered the bare minimum. However, on this channel, we don't care how old the hardware is, so today we're going to see if we can still game in 2017 on Windows 10 with only 2 gigabytes of RAM. One interesting thing to note is that Windows 10 alone uses almost 1 gigabyte of our available RAM. Our other system specs include a G3258 overclocked to 4.2 GHz and a GTX 760. The games we'll be playing today are League of Legends, Dirt Rally, and GTA 5. Because of our RAM limitation, I expect that we'll see significantly reduced frames per second and a lot of stutter in newer games. However, in older games, I expect that we'll see smaller differences due to their lower RAM requirements. I'll put our FPS using 8 gigabytes of RAM up on the screen as well so you can compare it yourself. First, let's try League of Legends. Even though I expected there to be less frame difference compared to 8 gigabytes of RAM due to the age of this game, the results from this game still surprised me. With 2 gigabytes of RAM, we averaged 178 frames per second on the lowest settings at 1080p. Our minimum frames per second of 125 wasn't that bad either, which is where lower amounts of RAM usually falter. On 8 gigabytes of RAM, we averaged 175 frames per second and had a minimum of 129. Oddly enough, 2 gigabytes of RAM actually got a higher frames per second, although I do believe that is within the margin of error. Next is Dirt Rally. This is one of the newer games that we tested, and so I expected the 2 gigabytes of RAM to not be able to play the game properly. However, I was pleasantly surprised. On the high settings preset at 1080p, we were able to run the game with an average of 58 frames per second and a minimum of 42. With 8 gigabytes of RAM, we saw an average of 58 frames per second as well, but the minimum was increased to 48 frames per second. However, our gaming on the 8 gigabyte kit was noticeably smoother, likely due to the more consistent frame times. If you've been enjoying the video so far, consider leaving a like or subscribing to see more of this content. But back to the video. Next is GTA 5. GTA 5 is considered very demanding and not known to run well with anything less than 8 gigabytes of RAM. That definitely held true in our testing. The 2 gigabytes of RAM was not able to run the game at all without stuttering. When we used 8 gigabytes of RAM, we got a smooth 44 frames per second experience on normal to high settings at 1080p. It's clear that this game is quite simply unplayable with 2 gigabytes of RAM. So what do these results mean? Should we stop recommending 8 gigabytes of RAM? Definitely not. However, it's interesting to see that in some games there's very little difference between 2 and 8 gigabytes of RAM in terms of frame rates. I guess it's pretty safe to say that for a light gaming PC, 4 gigabytes of RAM will definitely be sufficient. In some games like GTA 5 though, you simply can't play with anything less than 8 gigabytes of RAM. But anyways guys, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next video.